They called Camille Rhodes a burden for 7 years. In that silver boardroom 42 floors above Atlanta, they smiled when Byron Hale slid a final check across the table and told her that $3,200 was more than generous for a woman who had spent the best years of her life living off a future she never built. Camille looked at the check, then at the one-page deed tucked beneath it, a tired little document nobody else at that table had bothered to read. She signed every paper without asking for stock, without asking for the penthouse, without asking for one of the cars lined up in the garage downstairs. They thought she was weak. They thought she was embarrassed. They thought she was too shattered to negotiate. What Byron did not know, what his mother did not know, what the attorneys billing $2,000 an hour did not know, was that the only route into his company's biggest launch still crossed land that answered to one last name: Rhodes. The room smelled like cold coffee, leather folders, and expensive cologne. Byron leaned back in his chair the way men do when they think the world is finally arranged in the shape they deserve. Beside him sat his mother, Lorraine Hale, regal and rigid in cream silk and disappointment. She had never forgiven Camille for not being born into old money, never forgiven her for having a father who worked freight and a mother who taught public school, never forgiven her for the way Byron had once looked at Camille as if love could erase class. Across from them, Camille sat in a charcoal dress so simple it looked severe, her hands folded, her face unreadable. If silence had a shape, it was hers that day. And somehow that silence made them crueler, because people who rely on power hate nothing more than a person they cannot provoke. Byron had met Camille long before the magazine covers, long before Oraline Freight Systems became the darling of clean transport and venture capital. Back then, he was just a brilliant man with dangerous confidence and a mouth full of promises. And she was the woman who believed him when nobody else fully did. She took late-night calls from suppliers when his first trucks were stuck in Tennessee. She rewrote pitch decks at 2 a.m. She drove 6 hours with him to pitch investors who barely looked up from their phones. She hosted dinners for men who spoke to Byron like a visionary and to Camille like waitstaff. When the first warehouse opened, Byron raised a glass and called her his backbone. Years later, after the funding rounds, private flights, interviews, and designer suits, he rewrote that history in public. Suddenly she was emotional, unqualified, dead weight attached to a machine too valuable to slow down. The story changed because his money changed, and because money makes weak men believe memory belongs to whoever can afford the loudest version of it. The divorce did not begin with screaming. It began with strategy. First came the late nights, then the hotel charges disguised as travel meetings, then the carefully staged concern from his mother, then the press whispering that Oraline's founder and his wife had grown apart under the demands of greatness. By the time Camille saw photographs of Byron in St. Lucia with a lifestyle influencer half his age, his legal team had already prepared the moral language. Irreconcilable differences, privacy requested, mutual respect. It was all polished enough to make dishonesty look elegant. What they had not prepared for was Camille refusing to perform heartbreak for them. She did not break glasses. She did not beg. She did not leak. She watched. She listened. And when the paperwork came, she noticed that hidden among the real estate schedules and asset waivers was one forgotten line item dismissed as junk. Parcel 14B, South River Industrial Spur, 1.8 acres. No visual value. No immediate revenue. Transfer to Camille Rhodes. Lorraine had almost laughed when the deed was mentioned. "Take it," she had said. "It's weeds, rust, floodwater, and a tax headache." Byron smiled and told Camille the land had once belonged to her father's holding company, then fallen into Orleans' books during a restructuring so minor nobody cared. The company wanted a clean sheet. They were being generous. She could keep the ugly memory. He said it like mercy. Camille simply nodded and touched the corner of the deed with her thumb, because she remembered what her father used to say when they stood near that broken rail line at sunset and watched steel glow red under the Georgia heat. Never let rich people be the first ones to call something worthless. If they're in a rush to hand it away, look again. When the meeting ended, Byron rose without offering his hand. Camille gathered the check, the deed, and a single envelope from her attorney, then walked through the mirrored hallway toward the elevator. No one stopped her. No one apologized. Outside, Atlanta was wrapped in late afternoon heat, traffic lights bleeding into windshields, horns skipping across intersections like angry birds. She stood on the sidewalk and let the tower's revolving doors spin behind her. For the first time all day, her fingers tightened. Not from grief, from control. She could have cried then. She had earned that much. Instead, she unfolded the deed and read every line slowly while people in tailored suits brushed past her on their way to meetings they believed mattered more than her life. Halfway down the page, she saw the language she had hoped had survived. Perpetual access easement, rail ingress, stormwater corridor authority, transferable operating consent. 3 weeks later, Orleans Freight was scheduled to unveil the most important project in Byron Hale's career. The Rivergate Electrified Freight Corridor. Clean cargo, faster port clearance, state-backed incentives, smiling politicians, and a promise to turn Georgia into the beating heart of electric shipping across the Southeast. Investors from New York, Chicago, and Dubai had booked suites. The market expected Orleans stock to jump. What no camera crew knew, what no banker on television mentioned, was that the final certified route for the corridor still relied on the old South River Industrial Spur for emergency access, heavy load diversion, drainage compliance, and rail contingency during hazardous weather restrictions. In every presentation, that dependency appeared as a gray line tucked beneath bolder colors. Technical, invisible. Exactly the kind of detail arrogant people stop noticing once applause gets loud enough. Camille did not go home to mourn. She went to East Point, to a one-story brick building with sun-faded letters over the door that read Rhodes Tax and Business Services. It had once been run by her father on weekends after his freight shifts, a place where truckers came with receipts stuffed in glove compartments, and small business owners came with hope held together by paper clips. The office had been closed for 2 years since his death, but the filing cabinets were still there, the desk still there, the ceiling fan still complaining above the waiting chairs. She unlocked the back room, set the check on the desk, and opened the lowest drawer of a scarred filing cabinet labeled Rail, Legacy. Inside sat articles of incorporation for Rhodes Transit Holdings, old survey maps, utility agreements, handwritten notes in her father's clean block letters, and the kind of legal patience that outlives men who think speed is intelligence. Byron had not given her a weed patch. He had given her the hinge on a billion-dollar door. The $3,200 became the first move, not because it was a fortune, because insult money spends just as well as respect money when your hands are steady. Camille used part of it to pay reinstatement fees for Rhodes Transit Holdings, A dormant family LLC everyone assumed had died with her father. Another piece went to taxes Byron's people had neglected on purpose, hoping the parcel would eventually be seized in a routine sweep and disappear into county noise. Then she paid for certified copies of every easement, every drainage corridor map, every rail ingress record buried in county archives and railroad annexes. By the second day, she was sleeping 4 hours a night on a leather couch that smelled faintly of dust and toner, eating vending machine crackers and building a war room out of grief, memory, and public records. Her father had once told her that some fights are won by whoever gets tired last. Camille had just lost a marriage. Sleep no longer intimidated her. On the fourth morning, she called Monique Sayers. Monique was the kind of attorney powerful people hired only after they had made a mess too expensive for ordinary lawyers to untangle. Years earlier, she and Camille's father had worked together on a labor dispute involving a collapsed loading yard and an insurance company that tried to dodge responsibility until Camille Rhodes buried them in documents. Monique still remembered the lesson. "Your father believed in paper more than outrage," she said after hearing Camille out. "That made him dangerous." By noon, she was in the East Point office, sleeves rolled, glasses low on her nose, reading survey language while the copier groaned in the background. 30 minutes later, she looked up and smiled the thin, predatory smile lawyers wear when the law has finally become interesting. "Byron doesn't own his launch corridor," she said. "Worse, he built his financing narrative on the assumption that he did." What made the old parcel lethal was not the dirt. It was the permissions threaded through it like veins beneath skin. Decades earlier, when freight still moved under different names and different unions, the main industrial yard had been split during a bankruptcy. Most of the acreage went one way, but the access rights, drainage burden, and emergency rail turnout authority attached to Parcel 14B were never fully extinguished because Camille Rhodes, then just a supervisor with better instincts than the executives above him, had forced a protective clause into the transfer after a flood killed 2 workers on a night shift. That clause required written consent from the parcel holder before any operator could certify expanded heavy load use of the spur under a new environmental regime. Nobody cared for years because nobody was trying to build a state-branded electrified corridor with bond covenants, insurance triggers, and federal safety eyes on it. Now, it mattered more than any glass office Byron owned. Orlean could keep rolling without the parcel, only in theory. And theory is a fragile thing when lenders, insurers, and regulators start asking whether you lied by omission. Byron, meanwhile, was busy being adored. He appeared on morning television in a Navy suit and spoke about innovation, clean futures, and opportunity for working families, with the confidence of a man who had never unloaded a truck in August. Beside him, deliberately placed within camera range, was Talia Reid, the woman tabloids had gently described as a wellness entrepreneur and digital tastemaker. The comments online were vicious toward Camille, as comments always are toward the woman who disappears from a powerful man's story. Camille read none of it. Instead, she drove to Macon and met Elijah Boone in a diner off the interstate where the sweet tea tasted like memory and the booths had been polished by decades of elbows. Elijah had retired from Southern Crescent Rail with a reputation for knowing every dead line, buried spur, and forgotten contingency route from Savannah to Birmingham. He listened while Camille spread maps over the table. When he saw Parcel 14B, he let out a low whistle. "Lord have mercy," he said. "They did it again." He tapped the paper with one thick finger. "Men in a hurry. Every decade a new batch comes through thinking the future belongs to presentation slides. They buy land, flip names, cut ceremonies, and forget the old routes have old rules. If Orlean promised live freight through Rivergate during storm events, and this turnout sits where I think it sits, then your ex isn't sitting on a launch. He's sitting on a prayer. Elijah spent the next 2 days with Monique and Camille, moving between archived schematics, site photographs, and freight compliance manuals. Piece by piece, the picture sharpened. The corridor's public design boasted redundancy. Redundancy needed emergency diversion. Emergency diversion required turnout authority. Turnout authority crossed parcel 14B. Worse for Byron, a section of the new drainage mitigation trench tied directly into the old parcel's stormwater corridor, which meant the environmental insurer covering Rivergate had written its policy based on access assumptions that were only valid if the controlling parcel consented. No consent, no clean certification. No clean certification, no live launch. No live launch, and every speech, every valuation, every bond projection tied to the grand opening became vulnerable. Not necessarily illegal on its face, but unstable. And markets punish unstable faster than courts do. He built a cathedral on paperwork he never finished reading, Monique said. Those are my favorite cathedrals. Camille could have gone straight to Byron then. She could have called him, listened to the shock in his throat, and sold him relief by the hour. But revenge is often weakest at the moment it first becomes possible. Camille wanted more than his panic. She wanted control over what came after. Because for years she had watched Byron achieve something ugly with remarkable consistency. He made every crisis somebody else's sacrifice. Drivers lost schedules, assistants lost sleep. Small vendors waited 90 days to get paid. Communities near his facilities were promised jobs and handed noise. He was brilliant, yes, but brilliance without conscience is just an efficient way to spread damage. So Camille went wider. Through Monique, she approached a pension-backed infrastructure fund with a quiet position in Orlean debt. Through Elijah, she got a private audience with a risk analyst whose firm underwrote freight expansion bonds. Through a retired environmental engineer who still respected Camille Rhodes, she confirmed exactly how fragile the certification window had become. By the end of the week, she was no longer just an injured ex-wife with a piece of land. She was a decisive variable in a chain of people with money at stake. The moves around Byron did not look dramatic. A request for updated contingency language here. A late-night email from insurance counsel there. A request for proof of transferable turnout consent. Bureaucracy can sound harmless, right up until it becomes the sound of your oxygen thinning. Still, Byron remained relaxed. He was too close to his own mythology. The week of the launch, he hosted a rooftop dinner for investors at a hotel overlooking the city. White linen, string lights, a jazz trio. Talia in liquid gold, Byron in black. In every photograph, he looked like a man standing exactly where destiny had always intended. In none of them could you see Camille parked 3 blocks away in a rental sedan, reading the final opinion letter Monique had just sent to 3 institutions with the power to turn Rivergate from certainty into emergency. The opinion letter was surgical. It did not scream fraud. It merely attached the deed, the easement chain, the reinstated LLC status, the missing written consent, the insurer's dependency language, and the timetable under which any continued representation of fully secured launch readiness could expose operators, lenders, and certifying partners to material misstatement risk. In plain English, it said this: if Orlean turns the cameras on without resolving Parcel 14B, everyone standing near Byron could end up sharing his fall. By sunrise, 3 separate offices had acknowledged receipt. By noon, 2 requested urgent clarification from Orlean. By mid-afternoon, the environmental insurer froze final certificate release pending review. Byron still thought it was a routine delay. Men like him mistake the first crack for weather. They do not understand it is already the foundation speaking. That evening, Camille received the first direct message from Byron since the divorce papers were signed. Need to discuss minor title confusion. Call me tonight. No apology, no recognition. Camille let the phone light up, then fade. 10 minutes later, he called again. Then Lorraine, then Byron's chief legal officer. Camille answered none of them. Instead, she went to the Rivergate site and stood beyond the barricades while crews made final adjustments for the morning ceremony. Giant screens faced rows of chairs. Flags snapped in the wind. Electric cargo units sat polished and ready, their paint catching the floodlights like wet metal. Workers moved fast, but not happily. You can feel institutional fear before executives admit it. 2 insurance representatives were escorted into a trailer. A man in a reflective vest walked the turnout line twice while reading from a tablet. Camille slipped one hand into her coat pocket and touched the folded deed. The paper was softening at the edges from use. Power rarely announces itself with volume. Sometimes it is only paper held by the right person at the right hour. At 7 the next morning, Atlanta Business Radio was still praising Byron Hale when the first convoy rolled toward the industrial spur outside Rivergate. Governors, mayors, investors, and reporters were already taking their seats. A brass band tuned up near the platform. Talia posed for pictures beside a charging unit. Byron stood under a Navy awning, smiling for cameras. Then a white state compliance SUV arrived without ceremony and parked near the access gate. 2 officials stepped out. Behind them came an insurer's field representative, then a rail safety inspector. None of them moved like guests. Byron's smile did not vanish all at once. It thinned. One aide hurried over. Another sprinted toward the trailer. Down the line, the convoy stopped. 1 truck, then 2, then 6. Brake lights glowed red in the pale morning like a string of warnings nobody could edit out. A murmur passed through the audience. Reporters lifted phones. The band stopped playing. Across the lot, an argument broke open near the compliance vehicle. You could not hear words, only tones. Sharp, defensive. The kind of tones people use when they are discovering that somebody important has not told them the truth. Camille watched from beyond the media line, wearing sunglasses and an expression so calm it was almost merciful. 5 minutes later, the giant screen that was supposed to introduce Rivergate with cinematic graphics went black. 2 photographers abandoned the stage and moved toward the blocked access road. Because failure, unlike success, is always alive on camera. Byron tried to improvise. He returned to the microphone and joked about one last compliance dance before innovation could begin. But the line fell dead in the open air. Nobody laughed. Somewhere in the back, a journalist had already confirmed enough to post the first phrase that would ruin his day. Launch delayed over access certification dispute. Once those words hit the internet, they multiplied with the speed of blood in cold water. Traders saw them. Analysts saw them. Rivals saw them. One local station went live from the access gate, explaining that an unresolved property issue might affect the emergency rail and drainage compliance for the project Byron Hale had branded as fully ready. Fully ready. Those 2 words landed like stones. By the time Byron finally found out exactly who controlled Parcel 14B, his voice had changed. He called from a secure trailer with the door shut and half his future pacing outside. "What do you want?" he asked. "You should ask what I know," she said. Silence. Then breathing. Then Byron again, lower now. "Fine. What do you know?" Camille looked toward the halted trucks, each one motionless because of paper he had mocked. "I know your insurer froze final certification. I know your lenders were told your contingency access was secure. I know the turnout authority crosses my parcel. I know you plan to announce revenue timing today. And I know the market opens in less than 2 hours." He cursed then, not loudly, but with the clipped violence of a man slamming his own hand in a door. When he spoke again, he was trying to regain the old rhythm. "This doesn't have to be ugly," he said. "Name the number." Camille almost laughed. Byron still thought this was about him buying silence from a woman he had undervalued. "You gave me a number already," she said. $3,200. Remember? She let that sit. "Then maybe you should have thought about thousands of people before you treated critical paperwork like a woman you were done using." At 9:15, Orleans stock opened down 6%. By 9:23, it was down 11. Analysts on television began speaking carefully, which is how you know they are frightened. Byron's public relations chief released a statement calling the delay temporary. Temporary is what corporations say when they are praying time will become anesthesia. But the market kept bleeding because confidence has no loyalty. By 9:40, one of the pension funds Camille had quietly briefed requested an emergency governance review call with Orleans' independent directors. At 10:05, Monique received confirmation that the environmental insurer would not reinstate the launch certificate without written consent from Rhodes Transit Holdings and a fresh risk assessment. At 10:16, Byron called back. This time, there was no performance left. "Please," he said, and that single word carried more truth than everything he had said in the last year. Camille agreed to meet him at noon, but not at the site, not at his tower, and not anywhere he controlled. She chose her father's old office in East Point. Byron arrived in a black SUV with 2 lawyers and a chief financial officer, who looked like he had not blinked in hours. The moment Byron stepped into that small brick building, the geometry of his power changed. There were no marble floors, no reception team, no skyline. Just fluorescent light, framed tax licenses, a coffee machine older than his ego, and the smell of paper that had outlived several men's careers. Camille sat behind her father's desk, with Monique on one side and Elijah Boone on the other. Byron looked around once, as if offended by its refusal to be impressed. Then he looked at Camille and saw, perhaps for the first time in years, a woman who no longer needed anything from him. That was when fear finally reached his eyes in a permanent way. Monique did the talking first. Her terms were not designed to wound Byron emotionally. They were designed to remove his ability to wound other people operationally. Rhodes Transit Holdings would grant the necessary consents and structured access only under a comprehensive control agreement. Camille would receive a majority voting block through a forced equity conversion tied to emergency stabilization financing. Byron would step down as chief executive immediately upon execution and remain only as a non-operating founder, subject to clawback provisions. Orleans would establish a protected fund for delayed vendor payments and worker retention. The company would halt demolition activity affecting the South River neighborhood until an independent review was completed. Parcel 14B would be leased back, not sold, under premium terms. And the rescue package would be announced not as Byron's strategic pivot, but as a governance-led stabilization led by Camille Rhodes, whose control of critical transit rights made continuity possible. In a single structure, she was not just saving the company. She was inheriting the narrative. Byron's attorney objected first. The CFO said the market would read the terms as capitulation. Elijah Boone snorted at that and said, "Son, the market already read your boss before breakfast." Byron said nothing for nearly a minute. He stared at the papers, then at Camille, then at the framed photo on the shelf behind her of Camille Rhodes in a reflective vest, grinning beside an old locomotive. "You planned this," Byron said finally. Camille held his gaze. "No," she replied. "You planned this. You just planned it for me to lose." Lorraine called halfway through the meeting. Byron ignored her. Then she called again. Then again. The fourth time he answered, listened for 20 seconds, and went pale in a way expensive men are never prepared to do. Later, Camille learned one of the banks backing a line, secured against the Hale family's residential properties, had demanded immediate reassessment after the stock slide. Wealth feels permanent until it meets leverage. Then it starts speaking in deadlines. Byron asked for a private word with Camille. Monique advised against it. Camille allowed 5 minutes. They stood in the back room near the old filing cabinet where the entire turn of his life had begun. He lowered his voice and searched for something human enough to reopen the past. He said he had been under pressure. He said success had changed everything around him. He said people expected a version of him he did not know how to stop being. He said Talia meant nothing. He said he had never expected her to go this far. There it was again, buried beneath all the excuses. He had never expected her. Not really. Not all the way. Camille looked at him and felt the strange emptiness that comes when a wound finally closes from the inside. "You keep talking like this happened because you left me," she said. "It happened because you mistook my silence for weakness, my support for dependence, and my family's work for decorative background in your success story. You didn't lose control today because I became dangerous. You lost it because you were careless enough to believe I never was." At 2:14 that afternoon, Byron signed. He did it with the same hand that had pushed the $3,200 check toward her, except this time, the hand shook. The documents were thick, the terms brutal, and the room so quiet that the scratch of his pen sounded almost ceremonial. When it was over, Monique gathered the pages, Elijah exhaled, and Camille simply closed the folder. No dramatic smile, no raised voice, no speech. True reversal does not need to dance. It only needs to become official. Outside, reporters were already circling the East Point block after someone leaked the meeting location. By late afternoon, every business outlet in the state had some version of the same headline. Byron Hale steps aside as critical rights holder leads Orlean stabilization. Some headlines were kinder, some were not. But all of them placed Camille where Byron had never intended her to stand. At the center. Named. Necessary. The following week was uglier than victory stories usually admit. Lawsuits were threatened, then softened. Commentators argued over whether Byron had deceived investors or merely drowned in complexity. Talia vanished from public view. Lorraine issued a statement about family privacy that no one believed she had written without fury. A former vendor told a reporter that late payments had been routine for 2 years. A site foreman said safety complaints were often ignored until executives visited. A county commissioner suddenly very interested in accountability, demanded hearings on land treatment near South River. And every day, Camille showed up to the temporary Orleans command office before sunrise, hair pulled back, tablet in hand, moving through spreadsheets, insurance calls, worker briefings, and emergency board sessions with a focus so clean it made people stand straighter. She did not step in to destroy. She stepped in to prevent collapse from swallowing the wrong people. That was the difference between power and stewardship. Byron had never bothered to learn it. Camille had been practicing it quietly for years. Workers noticed first. Drivers who expected layoffs were told routes would be preserved during the certification reset. Small suppliers who had been ignored suddenly received calls about payment schedules. Community representatives who used to be treated like photo op furniture were invited to real planning sessions with real agendas and real signatures. Camille knew reputation could not be rebuilt with slogans, because she had spent too much of her marriage watching slogans float above unpaid cost. So she did the slow work. She required independent review of safety protocols. She reopened the South River demolition question. She tied executive bonuses to compliance, payment discipline, and labor retention, instead of stock spikes and media milestones. Some directors hated her within hours. Good. Boards often confuse discomfort with sabotage when someone finally insists they feel the consequences of their own shortcuts. She could live with being unpopular. She had survived being underestimated, and that is much harsher weather. 3 months later, Rivergate reopened under less glitter and more truth. No orchestra, no vanity drones, no governor smiling for headlines under impossible promises. Just workers, regulators, union reps, local families, and a modest press line kept behind marked tape. Camille stood at the edge of the site in a navy coat while the first authorized freight unit rolled through legally secured access beneath a sky still bruised from dawn. When a reporter asked her how it felt to save the company her ex-husband nearly lost, she answered without looking toward the cameras. "I didn't save his company," she said. "I protected people from his carelessness." It was the kind of sentence that travels because it cannot be improved by editing. By evening, it was everywhere. Workers printed it and taped it in break rooms. Vendors quoted it in interviews. Camille ignored that too. She was interested in outcomes, not worship. Worship had ruined Byron. She had watched it happen in real time. Byron's fall was not cinematic in the way people imagine. There was no handcuff parade, no operatic collapse on courthouse steps, no sudden poverty by sunset. Real consequences for wealthy men are often slower and more humiliating than that. He kept his name, but lost his command. He kept some money, but lost the velocity that made money feel like identity. His interviews disappeared. Invitations thinned. A profile that had once called him the future of American freight was quietly edited online. The penthouse went on the market before winter. Friends who once answered on the first ring became expertly unavailable. The men who had admired his ruthlessness most loudly were the first to explain, off record, that they had always worried about his impulsiveness. That is the loneliest part of collapse for men like Byron. Not losing assets, learning how quickly admiration was only rented. Camille did something with Parcel 14B that nobody in Byron's orbit would have predicted, because they never understood the values shaping her. She kept the lease terms firm, yes. She protected the rights, yes. but she also transformed the unused edge of the property into a training and logistics apprenticeship center named the Samuel Rhodes Transit Institute. Young people from South River, who had grown up hearing development promises like bedtime stories, were suddenly learning fleet diagnostics, electrical freight maintenance, dispatch software, and compliance operations in classrooms built where weeds once pushed through rust. A mural went up near the entrance, showing freight lines bending into routes and routes bending into roads. Her mother cried the first time she saw it. Elijah Boone spoke at the opening and said Samuel Rhodes would have laughed himself breathless at the thought that the little parcel rich people sneered at had become the seed of something large enough to outlive them all. On a cool evening nearly a year after the divorce, Camille returned alone to the boardroom where Byron had once pushed that check across polished wood like a dismissal. She was there for a final lease review, with directors who now stood when she entered the room. The skyline beyond the glass was copper and violet, Atlanta lit like a circuit board under dusk. Someone had changed the artwork on the wall. Someone had replaced the chairs. But the room still held an echo she could feel in her chest. The memory of having been measured, priced, and laughed at in silence. She stood by the window for a moment after everyone left and let herself finally feel the old pain without letting it own her. It had never really been about losing Byron. That grief had burned out long ago. It was about surviving the moment powerful people decide your loyalty was only valuable while it was useful to them. Surviving that does something permanent to a person. If you do it right, it does not harden you into cruelty. It clarifies you into steel. The last time Byron called was months later, after an industry summit where Camille had been invited to speak on resilient infrastructure governance and ethical freight expansion. He did not ask for money. He did not ask for a job. He asked a simpler and perhaps more difficult question. Did you ever hate me? Camille stood on a hotel balcony in Chicago, looking down at lake lights cutting through black water while the city wind pressed cold against her cheek. She thought about every answer he might deserve. Then she chose the truest one. No, she said. I grieved you. And then I outgrew the part of me that needed you to understand what you did. He was quiet a long time after that. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded smaller than the man she had once married. I should have read the deed. Camille almost smiled. You should have read a lot of things, she said, and ended the call. People still tell the story wrong when they tell it fast. They say a discarded woman got revenge with a piece of land. That version is easy, neat, and incomplete. The truth is harder and better. A woman who had been present at the building of an empire was written out of it by people who mistook proximity for dependence. She was handed what they considered an ugly leftover. And because she had memory, discipline, and the humility to look closely where they looked past, she found the pressure point holding their entire performance together. She did not scream. She did not sabotage. She did not invent their weakness. She revealed it. Then she used the moment not just to reverse humiliation, but to redesign power so it could not keep feeding on everybody beneath it. That is why the story lingers. Not because Byron fell. Men like him fall every day in smaller, less visible ways. It lingers because Camille turned insult into leverage, leverage into protection, and protection into legacy. And that is the kind of ending arrogance never sees coming, until the trucks stop moving and the microphones go dead.